constitutional right issue.
Just one second, Ralph. I want to bring in Jacqueline Stevens, a professor at Northwestern University, who has just published an exhaustive report on U.S. citizens who've been detained and deported. She's joining us from Chicago. We began the conversation with Jakadrien Turner, 15-year-old girl from Texas, who gives a false name when she's arrested. She's afraid. And this name links to a name of an undocumented immigrant. And though they take her fingerprints and they do biometrics and see she is not that person, she is still deported to Colombia. Her family's looking for her for a year. How typical is this, Jacqueline Stevens?
Well, I did research in the southern Arizona area to look at the rate at which people who had been detained in that area were found, had their deportation orders terminated by an immigration judge because they were determined to be U.S. citizens. And I found that between 2006 and 2008, 82 out of the over 8,000, the 8,007, I think, files that I considered showed these cases that were terminated because the people were found to be U.S. citizens. That area has 10% of the nation's detainees, and so I think it's reasonable on the basis of that research and additional research, including interviews with immigration judges, ICE agents, and people who've actually been deported, to extrapolate that figure. There was also a study that was done by the New York City Bar Association in 2009, and they found that 8% of the people that they interviewed in the Varick Detention Center appeared to be U.S. citizens. So I think there's a systemic problem in this country of ICE detaining and, in addition, deporting U.S. citizens.
Now, Professor Stevens,
I just want to say something about the 1% figure. Some people might think that sounds kind of low. I mean, it's just 1%. But in light of the massive sweeps and deportation efforts by ICE, in absolute numbers, that's actually quite large number. That works out to thousands of people each year who are U.S. citizens who are being detained or deported.
Professor Stevens, when you talk about cases being terminated because they're found to be U.S. citizens, these are people who may have spent months or years in detention while their cases were being adjudicated?
That's absolutely correct. So these are people who were either in the Florence or Eloy detention centers, and they were detained in some cases over a year before they were released. It's interesting because on the one hand, in a previous case of Mark Little, who was born in North Carolina and deported to Mexico, ICE tries to justify that by saying, oh, well, based on their documents, which were not reflective of his actual record, an immigration judge ordered his deportation. But there's a case going on right now in the southern Arizona area involving a man named George Ibarra. An immigration judge terminated his deportation order in February of 2010, in February of 2011, and yet ICE ignored that and held him in detention and appealed the termination, ignoring the evidence of his U.S. citizenship that he'd submitted. So as the gentlemen were saying in Texas, they do appear, ICE just really does appear to be bent on deporting people regardless of their valid claims to U.S. citizenship. There's a case going on right now in also in southern Arizona involving Esteban Tiznado, and he's the cousin of a gentleman named Humberto Carril Tiznado, who had his U.S. citizenship affirmed in June 2011 based on the same family history that also verifies Esteban Tiznado's U.S. citizenship. Both of these men had been deported and served, not only been deported, but they actually, when they returned to the United States, were convicted and served each years in prison for illegal re-entry. In 2008, Esteban Tiznado again returned after being deported following serving his prison sentence for illegal reentry, which is predicated on alienage. And at that point, he had a very good lawyer who presented evidence, had a jury trial, as opposed to the plea deal to which Esteban had been encouraged to agree in the previous trial. And the jury unanimously found him not guilty on the basis of the evidence that his lawyer presented of his U.S. citizenship. nonetheless, after he's found not guilty, ICE immediately deports him again. And so he then returned, and now, on the basis of legal work that was done on his behalf by a legal organization in that area, has a habeas order, a stay on his removal while the federal courts work out the mess that ICE has created.
And veterans, final point on the issue of veterans.
Excuse me, on the issue of veterans?
The issue of veterans deported. People,
well, so George Ibarra was an honorably discharged Marine, and he'd been deported. There's also, I guess, thousands of U.S. veterans who are in deportation proceedings or have been deported. There's an organization that was set up by Manuel Valenzuela and his brother. The Valenzuela brothers is their website, and they've documented these cases that involve people who have green cards, serve in the military, are honorably discharged, and then, because of a run-in with the law, are put into deportation proceedings, and they understandably find this very upsetting, and they're urging President Obama, after people have served their prison sentences, if they're veterans, for the president to pardon them so that these veterans won't be deported.